Fever had been climbing for 3 days now, and Jacob Thornton knew what that meant. His hand shook as he built the morning fire, not from the cold that bit through the cabin's log walls, but from whatever sickness had taken root in his blood after he'd fallen through the ice checking his trapline. The water had been so cold it felt like knives, and he'd pulled himself out more by instinct than strength, crawling back to the cabin as his clothes froze solid against his skin. He had maybe a week left, maybe less. The fever dreams had started last night. Visions of his daughter's face before the consumption took her. His wife's grave back in Boston that he'd never see again. He'd come north to escape those memories, to lose himself in the white silence where nothing reminded him of what he'd lost. 14 months of solitude, 14 months of nothing but wind and snow and the distant howl of wolves. It had almost worked. The medicine chest sat on the shelf above his bunk, and Jacob stared at it as he forced down some hardtack. 3 vials of quinine left, maybe 4 doses total if he rationed carefully, enough to fight off the fever probably, enough to buy himself time to make it to the trading post at Silver Creek, a 3-day journey when a man was healthy. He unscrewed 1 vial with trembling fingers, the glass cold against his palm. The sound came just as he lifted the vial to his lips, a thump against the door, soft and irregular, like something had collapsed against the wood. Jacob froze, listening. Nothing. Then another sound, weaker, this time almost a scratching. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the door, every muscle protesting. When he pulled it open, the wind threw ice crystals into his face, but he barely noticed. A child lay crumpled in the snow at his threshold, a girl maybe 10 or 11 years old, wearing sealskin and caribou hide that had been torn in several places. Blood had frozen in dark patches on her side and shoulder. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow enough that he almost missed it. Jacob didn't think. He grabbed her under the arms and dragged her inside, kicked the door shut, and laid her on his bunk. The wounds weren't deep, thank God, mostly lacerations from ice or rock, but her skin was pale and cold as marble. Exposure. She'd been out in the storm, probably all night. Her lips had turned blue. He stripped off her wet outer layers and wrapped her in his only 2 blankets and his spare bearskin, then built up the fire until the cabin was almost unbearably hot. She didn't wake, didn't move, except for the barely visible rise and fall of her chest. When he checked her eyes, the pupils were dilated. Hypothermia advancing fast. Jacob looked at the vials of quinine still sitting on the table where he'd left them. Then he looked at the girl. She couldn't have been much older than his daughter when the sickness took her. Same dark hair, though this child's was straight where Annie's had curled. Same small hands that should have been holding dolls or learning to sew, not fighting to survive in the frozen wilderness. He didn't let himself think about it too long. Thinking led to hesitation, and hesitation led to death out here. He took all 3 vials and a clean cloth, mixed the quinine with warm water, and began to carefully drip the solution between the girl's lips. Most of it ran down her chin at first, but some went down. He repeated the process, patient and methodical, until all 3 vials were empty. Then he made broth from his last bit of dried venison and spooned that into her mouth too, drop by drop. She swallowed reflexively, a good sign. He bathed the wounds with clean snow water and bound them with strips torn from his spare shirt. There wasn't much else he could do except keep the fire high and wait. The fever hit him hard around midnight. Jacob woke shaking so violently his teeth clattered together, and the cabin walls seemed to pulse and breathe in the firelight. He tried to get up to feed the fire, but his legs wouldn't support him. He crawled to the woodpile and threw on logs with hands that barely functioned, then collapsed on the floor, too weak to make it back to his chair. The girl was still unconscious on the bunk. At least she was still breathing. He watched her chest rise and fall, and thought about Annie, about how he'd given her everything, every doctor, every medicine, and it hadn't been enough. How he'd failed her, how he'd failed Sarah, how he'd run away from their graves because he couldn't bear to visit them, couldn't bear to admit that all his money and all his desperation hadn't been able to save the two people he loved most in the world. Maybe this was penance. Maybe this was grace. He didn't know any more. The fever stripped away pretense, left only truth. He'd given this child his medicine because he couldn't save his own daughter, and if he died for it, then at least he'd die having done something right. One good thing, one choice that mattered. The dreams came in waves, hot and suffocating. His wife telling him to come home, Annie reaching for him from the shadows, the ice breaking beneath him again and again, the black water pulling him down. He thrashed and moaned, and at some point, he wasn't sure when, someone touched his face with cool hands. Someone lifted his head and helped him drink water. Someone laid another blanket over him even though he was burning up. When he finally surfaced from the fever, weak as a newborn and soaked with sweat, pale gray light filtered through the cabin's single window. Dawn, or close to it. The fire had burned down to coals. He was on the floor where he'd collapsed, but someone had put his coat under his head as a pillow and wrapped him in every piece of fabric in the cabin. The girl was gone from the bunk. Jacob managed to push himself up on one elbow, head swimming. Had she died? Had he dreamed her entirely? But no. There were the blood-stained cloths he'd used to bind her wounds, still sitting on the table, the empty quinine vials. And the bunk blankets were in a heap on the floor around him, not on the bed where he'd left them. She'd covered him. Sometime in the night, the child had woken and taken care of him. The door was barred from the inside, which meant she was still here. He looked around the small cabin and finally spotted her, curled in the corner by the woodpile, watching him with dark, steady eyes. She hadn't run. She'd stayed. Jacob tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. The girl stood, and he realized she'd wrapped herself in his bearskin cloak, so large on her it dragged on the floor. She was Inuit, he saw now in the growing light, or perhaps Yup'ik. The markings on her torn clothing suggested a family from the far coastal clans. She moved to the water bucket, filled his tin cup, and brought it to him without a word. He drank, and she filled it again. The water was cold and perfect. When he'd had enough, she took the cup back and returned to her corner, pulling the bearskin tight around her shoulders. They stared at each other across the cabin's small space. "You should have run," Jacob wanted to say. "I'm dying anyway. The medicine was yours." But he didn't have the strength for words, and she didn't seem to expect them. She just watched him with those serious dark eyes, and gradually, as his head cleared a little, he understood. She knew. She knew what he'd done, knew what it meant. She'd stayed because running would have dishonored the gift. They sat like that as the dawn light strengthened. Jacob dozed in and out, the fever still present but no longer consuming him. The girl fed the fire when it burned low. She melted snow for water. She found his store of hardtack and dried fish and set some aside for him, eating only a little herself. She never spoke, but she moved around the cabin with quiet purpose, like a small ghost taking care of the dying. On the second day, Jacob felt strong enough to sit up, though standing was still beyond him. The girl helped him to his chair by the fire, her small hand surprisingly strong. She couldn't have weighed more than 70 pounds, but she moved him like he was made of paper. Children of the far north learned strength early, or they didn't survive. He tried to ask her name, where she'd come from, how she'd been hurt, but she only shook her head. Either she didn't speak English, or she'd been taught not to speak to strangers, or the trauma had stolen her voice. It didn't matter. She was alive, and that was enough. By the third day, Jacob knew he'd turned a corner. The fever was breaking, pulling back like a tide. He'd survived. Without the medicine, he'd somehow survived. The girl seemed to sense it too. She smiled at him for the first time. That morning, a quick flash of white teeth, and began gathering her things. No, Jacob wanted to say. Stay where it's warm. Stay where it's safe. But he knew she wouldn't. She had a family somewhere, a clan, people who must be desperate to find her. She'd stayed long enough to see him through the worst of it, and now he had to go home. She moved to the door and he tried to stand, managed it on the second attempt, legs shaking. Wait, he croaked. He went to his stores and pulled out a package of dried fish, some hardtack, a small bag of cornmeal. Not much, but he wouldn't need much to make it to Silver Creek now. She could have it. The girl took the food with both hands and pressed it to her chest, looking up at him with something that might have been gratitude or might have been understanding. Then she opened the door and slipped out into the snow, wrapped in his bearskin cloak, because her own clothes were still too torn to protect her. He'd intended to give it to her anyway. The cold rushed in, and he closed the door, stood there with his hand on the wood, listening to the silence. She was gone. He'd saved her, and she'd saved him, and now they were both alive, and maybe that balanced something somewhere in the universe. Maybe that made up for Annie just a little. He didn't believe it, but he wanted to. Jacob spent the next few days regaining his strength, forcing himself to eat, even when he had no appetite, walking circuits around the cabin, until his legs remembered how to carry him. He needed to get to Silver Creek before the next storm came. He needed supplies, needed to file his winter claim with the territory office, needed to start thinking about surviving until spring. He didn't think much about the girl. He tried not to. She was gone back to her people, and that was the end of it. Just another strange encounter in the north, the kind of story trappers told around fires that nobody quite believed. The time I saved an Inuit child, and she saved me back. Sure, friend. Tell us another one. On the 8th morning after she'd left, Jacob woke to silence. Not the usual silence of wind and distance, but the profound silence that meant something was very wrong. No birds, no cracking ice, no sound at all. He lay in his bunk and listened to his own heartbeat and felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. When he opened the door, the world had changed. The snow had been marked in a massive circle around his cabin, 50 yards in diameter, footprints and sled tracks and the marks of what must have been hundreds of people. They ringed him completely, and there, at the edge of the circle closest to his door, someone had planted a staff decorated with feathers and carved bone. Jacob stood in the doorway, in his long underwear, and felt his breath catch in his chest. He understood territorial markers when he saw them. This was a sign, a message. The girl's people had come, had found him, had surrounded him in the night, and they left him alive. He got dressed with shaking hands and walked out to the staff, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. The carvings on the bone were intricate, beautiful, each symbol deliberate. He couldn't read them, but he could feel their weight. They meant something important. They meant he'd been judged. A sound made him turn. In the distance, maybe a quarter-mile off, a line of sleds was visible against the white horizon. Not approaching, not leaving, just waiting. He raised one hand slowly, not sure what gesture would be right, what signal would convey respect and understanding. The line didn't move. Then, as he stood there with his arm raised and his heart pounding, the lead sled detached from the line and began moving toward him. It came slowly, deliberately, pulled by a team of 6 dogs that moved in perfect unison. As it drew closer, Jacob could make out 3 figures. The driver was a young man, his face tattooed with the marks of a proven hunter. Behind him sat an old man wrapped in furs and caribou hide, his face seamed with age, and between them, small and still, was the girl. The sled stopped 10 yards from Jacob's cabin. The old man stood, moving with the careful dignity of someone whose bones ached in the cold. The girl stood too, and Jacob saw that she wore new clothes now, seal skin and fur, pristine and warm. She looked healthy, alive. The wounds had healed to thin scars. The old man spoke, his voice carrying across the frozen air in a language Jacob didn't understand. But he didn't need to understand the words. The meaning was in the old man's eyes, in the way he gestured to the girl, to Jacob, to the cabin. You saved her. You gave her your medicine when you were dying. You sent her home fed and warm. The girl stepped forward and said something to the old man, who listened and nodded. Then she reached into the sled and pulled out a bundle, walked across the snow, and offered it to Jacob with both hands. He took it, not knowing what else to do. The bundle was heavy, wrapped in sealskin and tied with sinew. The girl looked up at him one more time, that same serious expression, and he saw tears on her cheeks. Then she turned and ran back to the sled, climbed in, and the old man raised one hand in what might have been a blessing or a farewell. The sled turned and rejoined the line on the horizon, and together they all began to move, sliding away across the snow until they were nothing but dark specks against the white. Jacob stood in front of his cabin, holding the bundle and watching them go until they disappeared completely. Inside the cabin, he unwrapped the sealskin with shaking hands. Medicine, dozens of vials, some glass, some carved bone, each one stoppered and labeled in symbols he didn't understand. Enough medicine to last him years, enough to trade for a fortune at any post, and wrapped among the vials, pressed dried herbs he recognized as feverfew, yarrow, willow bark, a healer's kit, a doctor's gift. But there was more. Beneath the medicine lay packages of pemmican, dried fish, seal fat, enough food to see him through to spring twice over. And at the bottom, wrapped in soft leather, was a knife. Not a utility blade, but a ceremonial knife. The handle carved from walrus ivory and inlaid with symbols that matched the staff outside. The blade was obsidian, black and perfect, sharp enough to split hair. Jacob sat on his bunk, holding the knife, and felt something break inside his chest. Not grief this time. Not the crushing weight of failure, something else, something that felt almost like forgiveness. He'd given the girl his last medicine because it was the right thing to do, because he couldn't watch another child die when he had the power to prevent it, even if it cost him his own life. He hadn't expected to survive. He certainly hadn't expected this. But the girl's people had come, had surrounded him, had judged him, and they'd found him worthy. The old man had been a shaman, Jacob was sure of it. The marks on his face, the way he'd stood, the authority in his gestures. A spiritual leader, maybe the girl's grandfather. He'd brought the medicine, had paid the debt 100 times over, but more than that, He'd given Jacob something he hadn't even known he needed. Absolution. Proof that one good choice, one moment of grace, could ripple outward and change everything. Jacob went to the door and looked out at the marked snow, the circle of footprints, the ceremonial staff. They'd surrounded him not to threaten, but to protect, he understood now, to mark him as under their protection. The staff was a ward, a sign to any other traveler that this place, this man, was sacred, untouchable. The clans would know, the hunters would know, even the wolves would know somehow, in the way that animals understood things humans had forgotten. He thought about Annie, about how he'd been unable to save her, how he'd carried that failure like a stone in his chest for so long it had become part of him. But he'd saved the Inuit girl. He'd given her everything he had, expected nothing, and she'd lived. She'd gone home, and her people had come to say thank you in the only way that mattered, with medicine for his sickness, with food for his hunger, with protection for his isolation. That night, Jacob lit the fire and cooked a proper meal for the first time in weeks. Using the seal fat and dried fish from the bundle, he ate slowly, tasting every bite, feeling his strength return with each swallow. When he was done, he took the obsidian knife and held it to the firelight, watching the flames dance across the black glass. Tomorrow, he'd check his trap line. Tomorrow, he'd start planning for spring. Tomorrow, he'd begin the work of living again, really living, not just surviving. But tonight, he sat by the fire and thought about the girl's face when she'd brought him water, the old shaman's blessing, the line of sleds on the horizon. The north was full of ghosts, everyone said. The ghosts of men who'd died in the cold, who'd lost themselves in the white silence, who'd given up hope and laid down in the snow. But maybe there were other kinds of ghosts, too. Maybe there were the ghosts of moments when someone chose kindness over survival, grace over fear. Maybe those ghosts were stronger. Jacob Thornton had come north to die, or at least to forget he was alive. But a small girl bleeding in the snow had changed that. She'd taken his medicine, his food, his warmth, and she'd given him something back that couldn't be measured in vials or furs or knives. She'd given him a reason to survive. She'd given him proof that his life still mattered, that his choices still had weight, that he wasn't just a ghost already. The fever was gone. The sickness had passed, and for the first time since he'd buried his wife and daughter Jacob, felt something that might have been peace. Not happiness, not yet, but peace. The knowledge that he'd done one thing right, and that it had been enough. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the cabin's corners. Inside, the fire crackled and popped. Jacob wrapped himself in his blankets and closed his eyes. And for the first time in 14 months, he didn't dream of graves. He dreamed of spring, of the ice breaking on the river, of the sun rising higher each day. He dreamed of a small girl's smile, and an old man's blessing, and a circle of protection drawn in the snow. He dreamed of living. If stories like this one move you, if they remind you that even in the coldest, most isolated places, human kindness can still light the way forward, then maybe you'll want to hear more. There are so many tales from the frozen frontier, stories of survival and grace, of debts paid and circles drawn, of people who chose to be good when no one was watching. Subscribe to hear them, because sometimes in the darkest winters of our lives, we all need to remember that one small act of kindness can change everything.